All right, so I'm going to start here with the fun little task of getting my screen shared and getting our presentation started for today. So welcome. Thank you so much for attending our webinar this morning, How Renewable Energy is Building the Reliable Grid of the Future. I'll talk more about our speakers in a bit, but joining us today, we have John Norris, former Iowa Utilities Board Chair, and Michael Goggin, Utility Transmission Expert. And our webinar today is presented by a number of groups: the Clean Energy Districts of Iowa, the Environmental Law and Policy Center, the Iowa Environmental Council, Iowa Interfaith Power and Light, and Sierra Club Beyond Coal. So a number of factors really came together that pushed us towards realizing that this was an important topic that we needed to talk about. Before summer even began, we had warnings coming from our regional grid operator, MISO, that they were looking at a possible capacity shortfall during a summer that was expected to have record heat and record demand for electricity. Later in the summer, we had MISO approve a set of transmission lines that will really be crucial to the increased reliable use of renewable resources. And then in August, the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act really changed the landscape for the economics of renewable energy compared to fossil fuels, even more than it's already been the case, that economics has been favorable. And so not only were we already looking at a transition that was happening, but we expect to see that transition actually accelerate over the coming few years. And we know that in order to ensure a resilient and reliable grid, that has to be done in a way that has a lot of smart planning and preparation and the right mix of resources, transmission, all the things we need to create a reliable system. So we wanted to bring in a couple of folks who really have expertise in this area to provide some more background, detail, expertise to folks here in Iowa about how we really can build this renewable, reliable grid of the future. So a few guidelines for the presentation today. We are in a webinar format, so attendees are off camera and muted by default. We ask you to utilize the Q&A tool for questions and feel free to put those in as they come up. We will save questions until the end of the presentations. And then if you're having any kind of technical difficulties with volume or visuals, please throw it in the chat and let us know. So our first presenter today will be John Norris. John is currently serving as Polk County Administrator, a job he's had since 2020, and he continues to serve as an Energy, Agriculture, and Environmental Policy Advisor at State Public Policy Group and Esman Research based here in Des Moines. John has over 3 decades of political policy and administrative experience at the highest levels of state and federal government, including extensive experience on energy and agricultural issues. He was appointed by President Obama to serve as commissioner on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in 2007 and in 2012. And in 1999, Iowa Governor Tom Vilsack asked Norris to chair the governor's working group on electric restructuring. The legislation resulting from Norris's leadership made Iowa a national leader in wind generation. Vilsack subsequently appointed Norris as chairman of the Iowa Utilities Board. While chairman of the IUB, Norris was also elected president of the Organization of Midwest Independent System Operator States, the MISO states. And Norris has spoken extensively on energy, agriculture, and regulatory issues, both domestically and internationally. In addition to his extensive policy development work, Norris has served as chief of staff at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, chief of staff for Governor Tom Vilsack, chief of staff for U.S. Congressman Leonard Boswell, and the state director of the Iowa Farm Unity Coalition. Really great to have you, John. And then for some reason, this is flipping on me. Our second speaker today is Michael Goggin. And Michael has worked on renewable energy, transmission, and electricity market issues for over 15 years. At Grid Strategies, he serves as an expert on those topics for a range of clean energy industry and environmental advocate clients. For the preceding 10 years, he worked at the American Wind Energy Association, where he provided technical analysis and advocacy regarding renewable energy, transmission, and renewable integration into the electricity markets, including directing the organization's research and analysis team from 2014 until 2018. Prior to his work with AWEA, he worked at a firm serving as a consultant to the U.S. Department of Energy. In the course of Michael's work, he has testified before dozens of utility commissions, including the Iowa Utilities Board. He has co-authored around 100 filings with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, served as a technical reviewer for over a dozen national laboratory reports, academic articles, and renewable integration studies, and published academic articles and conference presentations on renewable integration, transmission, and policy. He graduated with honors from Harvard University. So with that, and our distinguished guests today, I will kick it off to you, John, to get us started.
All right. Thank you, Trey. And before I really get started, I'm going to wrinkle at you right away. I hadn't had you prepare for this, but I have a trivia question for our audience today. So I suppose if I had you drop it in the chat, it'd be okay. Okay. So the trivia question is, in 1996, FERC issued the open access transmission tariff and titled it Order 888. What was the significance, or how did FERC choose Order 888 for this transformational filing for FERC order in 1996? I'll give you a second or a minute or two to answer that. And then I'll explain why I think it's appropriate to our discussion here today. Thank you all for participating. A great audience today, and thank you, Carrie, for your kind introduction, and Michael, great to be on here with someone who's a whole lot smarter about this stuff than me. But so look forward to Michael getting in the weeds with you and with all the data and how this is working. And I'll give you a little bit more of my 30,000 foot view today, which is really, I'll just cover, how we got here, what is this transition we're in, and where do we need to go, or what are the pieces we need to move this forward. So in that regard, how we got here, let's see if anybody had the right answer. And why 888? Oh, so Mark Frank wants an award for the right answer. Your award is me announcing your name as being a FERC geek.
It's the street address, right?
It is the street address. I know you were all expecting something much more monumental than that, but let me tell you why that's significant. In the fall of 1995, FERC moved out of a headquarters office building complex that I had never been in, actually never got to see. Moved into their great new building at 888 First Street, Southeast in Washington, D.C. Just a few months later than that, they issued Order 888 and named it after this building, which was a huge change for FERC. And that's why I think this is relevant. I mean, Order 888 and the open access to transmission tariffs and all its offspring, 889, Order 2000, Order 1000, were just like FERC. The change in their, I've heard so many stories about the old, I think mouse, might have said rat infested old building to this new building that FERC had at 888 First Street is symbolic for FERC. This order was significant enough they wanted to name it after their new building, because I think that really began a lot of the transformation we're having in the electric sector still today, because it recognized how much we would benefit from getting away from our kind of siloed, very protected, guarded turf, if you will, of utilities and their transmission system and their generation network, because they had to allow fair access to that transmission grid. And from that grew more competition for pricing, better for consumers, enhanced reliability because it recognized the value of being able to share resources across a broader footprint for reliability purposes. And that, to me, was the brainchild and the origin of where we've grown, but also in the direction we still need to continue to grow, to have our electric system evolve and transition to meet the needs of the future. So our mentality is still evolving too. And it's still being resisted by vested interests. The resistance to this change still remains strong over 2.5 decades later. We have the vertical integration history. We have this mentality that we see generation as jobs. And so this history of wanting to have a power plant built in your state or in your district meant jobs. We want a generation close to load. It also reflects the historical sophistication of the utilities industry's government relations operation, which I think is probably the most sophisticated, most advanced of probably any sector in our economy, because their whole revenue was dependent upon persuading government officials to give them a reasonable rate of return. Some would say, in some cases, maybe unreasonable rate of return. And this sense of control. And it was built on this construct that we shipped fuel to the generation center to then ship out the electrons. And all that's been turned on its head beginning with 888 and where we are at today. But the mindset still is evolving amongst regulators and certainly amongst those vested interests. And though that mindset is changing much slower than the technology is changing. We are not historically a very nimble industry. And so fighting that resistance exists clear today. And where I'm most close to, MISO, which is now the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, we're still seeing tremendous resistance from vested interest, particularly from vertically integrated utilities. So that's a quick history lesson here. But let me just bring this up now to where we started. I think the next significant piece in MISO and Iowa's energy future was back in 2007, actually preceded by a few months over scotch at a bar in a snowstorm at Carmel, Indiana, which is the headquarters of MISO. Between myself, the Wisconsin chair, Dan Ebert, and the president of MISO, Claire Moeller, began this discussion about states are now starting to set renewable energy portfolio standards. And this is going to become a challenge for our system to meet that, because the transmission grid was not built to accommodate that. Another thing that sticks out in my mind from that conversation was that when Claire said that coal, this is like a golden rule, or is that coal would always be the first energy in the dispatch stack. That was industry assumption, gospel, that coal would always be the cheapest form of electricity, and it would always be the first dispatch in the stack. So that began to be dispelled thanks to some leadership of 7 upper Midwest governors. In 2007, called upon MISO to begin to address the interconnection queue, because the backlog that was starting to occur around the new wind generation that was being built in Minnesota and Iowa primarily, and the Dakotas. In 2008, the 5 upper Midwest governors, Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas, all formed what was called the Upper Midwest Transmission Development Initiative. And that was the outgrowth of these governors calling for addressing the interconnection queue backlog for wind clear back in 2007. That led to MISO doing what FERC Order 2000 said to do, was to begin regional transmission planning. And so that's when MISO really got serious about transmission planning, that led to the MVP projects that were approved by FERC in 2011 that are still not completely built today. but have been all of it were already fully subscribed years ago. So that's just some perspective on how slow this moves and how much, while we've changed immensely, is still yet to be done. Carrie, would you throw that slide up on MISO's announcement? I think it is yesterday or this week. This gives you another perspective. So in 2007, 7 governors in the upper Midwest were asking MISO to address the backlog of the interconnection queue. And I didn't have a chance to look up how many megawatts, but it was definitely in megawatts, not gigawatts, that were causing a backlog in the interconnection queue in 2007. Just yet, this week, MISO announced a record number of proposed projects in MISO. 114 gigawatts of renewables and storage are in the MISO queue waiting, an additional 164 gigawatts. Actually, that's not even the, is that right? Yeah, 164 gigawatts of renewables and storage have applied to enter the queue in 2022. As you can see there in tranche 1 from MISO was just approved this summer, will enable 53 gigawatts of renewables and storage. But the number I was referring to is the 164, and that is what was announced in MISO. 956 applications for 171 gigawatts of new generation across the MISO footprint, which is over twice what was announced last year, and the previous year was half of that. So the amount of renewable energy that wants to be a part of our system is phenomenal, and it's just system changing. If we can get the system to stop resisting this change, and it's not just wind generation and solar generation, but there were 36, I believe, megawatts of proposed storage and hybrid projects, and 34 megawatts of just storage alone projects in those projects that MISO just announced. So the transition is definitely underway. It's underway both in the number of solar, wind, and storage projects that our investors are ready to invest in. It's been underway for some time in demand response, in the advancement of energy efficiency, advanced core conductors, and even dynamic lighting. We're seeing technology enabling so much transition in this energy space. But our big holdback right now is to continue that mindset that FERC had clear back in '96, which is we will be better off from a competitive and cost standpoint and from a reliability standpoint if we expand our vision and actual operation of our transmission grid. And we're why is there so much resistance to this? We're talking about shifting from a generation system dependent upon fossil fuels and just fuel in general to a system that there is no fuel cost. So much of the resistance for transmission also comes because people see the increase in transmission cost. But the all-in cost of electricity is going down with the expansion of wind and solar because they are both zero cost fuel and lower cost today because the advancement of technology. And what's holding back this lower cost energy is a grid system that today cannot accommodate near the potential we have. If you follow fuel prices, the natural gas price is nearly quadrupled in the last year. The cost per fuel for wind and solar will never change. It'll always be zero. Average kilowatt price now of 9 cents will likely be 6 cents 25 years from now if we build the transmission grid to allow this transmission grid to allow this transition to occur. Just 5 years ago in Iowa, we had 48 projects, 6,336 megawatts of projects withdrawn from the queue because we didn't have the grid to accommodate that. That was thousands of jobs, cleaner energy. for Iowans in Iowa alone has been missing out on tremendous opportunity. Now, this new tranche one that MISO passed in July has a cost benefit ratio for Iowans of between 3.5 and 4.5 cents to 1 cent of investment. So this makes economic sense for consumers, for our economy, produces jobs, and eliminates fuel costs, and has so many environmental benefits as well, not to mention addressing climate change. That we've got to have a bigger breakthrough from the folks that want to resist this change. So I probably wandered a bit there. I hope I covered some of the pieces you wanted me to cover, Carrie, and I'll pause there and let Michael get into some of the evidence here that this is real, that we can actually have a system that is cleaner and more reliable. So while you titled this, I believe renewable energy is driving or is building the reliable grid. I think it's driving. It's driving us, just like FERC started with in '88, seeing the value of transition planning and better utilization of all of our resources. This just incredible willingness to invest in renewable energy across our economic sector is driving the investment in new transmission, but it's not driving it fast enough for consumers to fully realize the value of it, our environment to fully realize the value of it. And you will always hear those vested interests in maintaining the current system or just have an endless number of reasons why we can't do this. I ask you to look behind that curtain though. Why are they saying that? Because the evidence, as Michael's going to share with you, is becoming overwhelming that we can transition this system and be more reliable at the same time.
Thank you so much, John. Michael, I'm going to stop my screen share here so you can take over.
Okay. My Microsoft Office just decided to do a restart on me, so I can't load PowerPoint at the moment. Do you have my slides handy?
I do.
Excellent.
Let me fix that quick. Love that when that happens.
Yeah, we can make a grid work on 100% renewables, but we can't time when my office decides to do an update.
All right, one moment here.
Okay, I'll go ahead and start talking. So thanks everybody for joining. So I'm going to talk about, oh, here we go. My Microsoft decided to work now. Here we go. I can do the screen share if you want.
Okay, go for it.
All right. Okay. Let's see. Can you guys see my screen? Let's see.
Yep, I can see it. If you start the slideshow, I think it should work.
Yeah, it's not letting me do that. Oh, here we go. Okay, there we go. Technical difficulties. Okay, sorry, everybody. Okay, so I'm going to talk about reliability today and basically how we can, as John was explaining, the cost trajectory of wind and solar and storage has been dramatically down. And so now I think, the cost is a no-brainer. Wind, solar are going to be the lowest cost sources of energy going forward. The real remaining question is how do we integrate the wind and solar reliably? And that's what I'm going to talk about today. And as John has laid out, a lot of it has to do with having a large grid and expanding transmission, which gives you access to the low-cost renewables, but also allows you to balance out the fluctuations in electricity supply and demand. The wind is always blowing somewhere. It's the clouds, it's always not cloudy somewhere. And transmission allows you to build a grid that's bigger than the weather systems that affect wind and solar, but also affect electricity demand. And as we've seen during events like Winter Storm Yuris, also affect conventional generators. So here's where we are today. You can see Iowa is the national leader in renewable energy deployment. This is combined wind and solar deployment. You can see over 55%. This is as of 2021. I think it's going to continue going higher. Nationally, we're at 13%. So you can see there's a lot of states that have higher to go, and a lot of, I think, the wind and solar that they're going to want to access, and particularly the wind, is going to come from places with high quality resources. And so having a strong transmission grid is going to be a big part of what we need to get the national level of renewable energy higher. And that, I think, is a great opportunity for economic development and other opportunity in Iowa and other interior states that have really the best wind resources in the US and some of the best in the world. And how high can we go? So on the right here are a few grid operator and other studies that have looked at what penetrations of renewable energy are feasible. I just updated the national one because about a week or two ago, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory came out with one looking at 100% by 2035, and basically concluding that that's feasible. Obviously there's a lot of investments and changes that need to happen over the next 13 years, which is pretty ambitious, but we can do it. And I'm going to go into a little more detail on how we can do that. You can see, we can also look at other countries and see that we can do this. And in many European countries are 5, 10 times, 5, 6, 7, 8 times more renewable energy power than we are. And some of those, like Ireland, are islands, which makes it extremely challenging to go to high renewable penetrations because they don't have that geographic diversity that we do as a large country with various different wind regimes. So I think the opportunity to go to very high renewable penetrations is there. And grid operators have recognized this. The change over the last decade, as John was talking about, is dramatic, with the transformation of the market and just learning how to operate the power system with high levels of renewables. You can see, you don't read these quotes, but multiple grid operators are now saying, we've gone, many, many times higher than they thought was feasible just 10 years ago. And, really the sky is the limit going forward. So how do we do that? So I'm going to get into detail and talk about 4 key time periods that grid operators deal with when making sure that the power system is reliable. And in Iowa, most of these functions are done by MISO. Some of the extent it's done by individual utilities and the state utility commissions. So the years ahead, and this is probably going to be the biggest focus of my talk because it's one of the most challenging aspects, is basically ensuring resource adequacy, having enough power plants and enough transmission to get that power to customers during peak demand periods. That's typically during the summer, can also be during the winter in some areas. And how do we do this? There's utility planning that goes into it that's overseen by state utility commissions. In MISO, there's also a voluntary capacity auction where utilities can, if they have extra or they're short, they can true up and buy and sell capacity in that market. And this is, typically when utilities and the commissions are looking at this, they're using capacity expansion models to figure out what's the cheapest set of resources we should build to reliably meet demand at lowest cost. There's also the operating time scale. So everything I just talked about, kind of the years ahead, is the planning time scale that grid operators will talk to you about. The operating time scale deals with, okay, we've got the power plants built. How do we use them most efficiently? And that's done to minimize, it's also done to minimize cost. You want to use the cheapest fuel sources first. So when solar have no fuel cost, you use them, then you go up to nuclear, coal, hydro, gas, et cetera, on up the supply curve. And this is done by MISO. They have a day ahead and then a real-time energy market where these generators bid in the cost for them to produce power. MISO determines the lowest cost way to meet that. And then those power plants run. There's a lot that goes into this. There's various types of reserves and other things that deal with fluctuations in supply and demand. There's a lot of wind forecast. You do forecasting for wind, increasingly for solar. You do your demand forecast, and you basically try to make sure that you've got enough power plants turned on and ready to go when you need them. And then, and I'll talk at the very end a little bit about kind of this, the one on the far right, the second-to-second time scale. There's a lot of important reliability services that make sure the grid is stable and will ride through a disturbance if you lose a large power plant or something like that. And wind and solar and storage have excellent abilities to do a lot of those services. So I'll talk about that at the end. So again, as I said, I'm going to focus mostly on kind of the story of how do we make sure we're going to be able to keep the lights on when demand is highest. And we do this, we talk about capacity value here. And this is different from, you may have heard capacity factor, which is how much over the course of a year, how much a wind project or a solar project or some other plant, how much energy it's going to produce. Capacity value is the percent of that resource's nameplate capacity that you can reliably depend on being there during peak demand periods. And this is a statistical calculation. You can see the results for various grid operators there. Wind, it's not particularly high. During hot summer afternoons, the wind output is not that high. Solar, fortunately, is really good during those hot summer afternoons. Makes sense, it's hot, the sun's out in the summer. And so what you get is wind and solar and storage work together. And I'll go into a little more detail on that. When you put them together, the wind is really good in the winter, in the spring when the sun's not so good. The wind's really good at night. The sun's obviously the best during the summer and during the day. And so wind and solar work together really well, they're complementary. And then you put storage in there to kind of fill in the gaps between them. And that can build a reliable power system. And that's what's come out of the modeling by NREL and the other grid operators. We're also people are increasingly looking at the capacity value of conventional generators. Standard utility practice was used to just assume, okay, they're going to fail 5% of the time or something, and we'll kind of, so a 100 megawatt gas plant will account on 95 megawatts of that being there. We're increasingly realizing that's not accurate. Gas plants in particular tend to fail at the same time, whether due to equipment issues in extreme cold or heat, or a lack of fuel supply. If the pipeline is congested and everybody's using it for heating their homes, the gas plants go offline. And that's primarily what happened in Winter Storm Uri. But these types of outages can happen to all types of conventional, all resources. As we've just gone through, wind and solar are subject to the weather, but so are coal plants, so are nuclear plants. They've all gone offline during extreme cold or extreme heat. Drought is a major factor, not just for hydropower, but coal plants, nuclear plants, they need cooling water to operate efficiently. And there are various instances where they've been derated or even gone offline because that wasn't available. And so when you put this all together and kind of the way these numbers work down here in the bottom table, when you get down to the bottom, the old assumption that they were 95% reliable, you're actually looking at something like the 70% range in winter and other time periods like that. And that, I think, really kind of changes how we need to think about reliability. It's about diversity, because the challenges that fuel supply that are cooling water or things like that are affecting a lot of thermal, the fossil and nuclear generators are things that don't affect wind and solar. They don't need water, they don't need fuel. And so putting them together gives you a system that's more resilient. And I think that's one of the big themes today, is that this is all about diversity, whether it's using transmission to access diverse wind and diverse solar, and also having a diversity of flexible resources, cheap energy and capacity on the system is the key to making this work. And so here's a little bit more on this kind of how wind, solar, storage fit together. You can see the chart here at the bottom is showing that I talked about how wind and solar fit together. Solar and storage fit very well together. And you'll see a lot of solar plants today are being installed with batteries on site, in part because of this reason. And basically what happens is, you see on the left side there, the solar is great during the afternoon, during the summer. It's basically taking a big chunk off your peak demand. However, as it does that, the peak net load, which is kind of your peak demand minus your renewable output, gets shifted later and later in the evening. And you might have heard this talked about as the duck curve. It's famous, it's very noticeable in California as this has happened. Peak net load in California is now basically after the sun has set in the evening. And that actually increases, what we're seeing here on the right side, is that increases the capacity value of battery storage. So a 4-hour battery, it used to, if your peak was previously from 2 p.m. to 8 p.m., that's 6 hours, a 4-hour battery couldn't meet that. But now the solar is carrying you through, from that, 2 p.m. to 6 p.m., 7 p.m.-ish, depending on the time of year. And then the battery can kick in and when your peak net load goes from 6 or 7 to 9 or 10 at night. And that's within the 4-hour duration of the battery. And so the combined capacity value of solar and storage is greater than the sum of its parts. And I think that's the key story we're telling here, is that the wind, solar, storage work together to build something that's greater than the sum of its parts. And here's, I was talking about the complementary nature of wind and solar. You can see this here. So the left side is wind, and this is across different seasons. You can see it's better in the winter, which are the blue lines, than in the summer, which are the orange lines. But you can also see, that basically the wind output dips during the middle of the day during most of the year. But obviously that's when solar is the best. So when you put the left curve and the right curve together, you're covering most of what you need. You're having high energy output during most of the hours you need it. And then again, you just use the batteries to kind of fill in around that, as well as, there's going to be other things we use. A lot of it's going to be existing flexible resources like hydropower is extremely flexible. You can store, a hydropower dam is like a big battery, and we're going to use that, I think, continue to use that for many, many decades at least to come. And other existing, flexible resources may, I think, continue to be used as well. You can see wind, again, the slide I was showing before is just this kind of typical patterns. Wind during many weather systems, wind output is very good during peak demand. And this is up from earlier this summer during the really hot period in June in MISO when they experienced their peak demand. Wind output was consistently good across those high demand days. You can see the blue there at the top is wind. In MISO North, the majority of the energy was coming from wind on those peak demand days. So again, the key is having diversity and resources that are available when you need them. So I was talking about and kind of continuing on that theme, we've always had a diversity or a division of labor on the power system where you didn't rely on just one resource. So a lot of people kind of talk about coal or nuclear and say, okay, we could just run them flat out, to meet all of our needs because they run 24/7. They're not flexible resources. The electricity demand varies by a factor of 3 over the course of a day or over the course of a year. And you need a supply resource that can follow those changes in demand. If you can't do that, the lights are going to go out. And that flexibility is just as important as the capacity and the energy. And so what we've done historically was we use coal and nuclear as kind of the lowest cost source of energy. And we put flexible resources on top of that. So we'd use hydropower, we'd use gas plants, even oil-fired power plants on top of that. And those would be flexible resources. They would change to follow demand. Now we have a new paradigm, and the top 3 energy sources here are increasingly providing all of the services we need: the wind, solar, and storage. The wind and solar are like what coal and nuclear used to do. They're the cheap resource. You use them because they have low cost energy. They give you some capacity, but they're pretty. You can use them flexibly. You can dispatch them around. I'll show you a few slides of that. Grid operators and utilities are using wind and solar to follow changes in demand. They're very fast resources, but doing that requires curtailing the energy, and so it comes at a high cost. But as we get more wind and solar, and we're curtailing it anyway because we have so much of it, I think that's increasingly going to be a big part of the solution. Batteries, however, are extremely flexible, and it's very cheap to ramp them up and down. That's what they're for. And so I think there are going to be a lot of the flexibility and the capacity to kind of fill in around the wind and solar. And so this is, it's actually very similar to how grid operators have been doing this for 100 years. The coal and nuclear are just being replaced with wind and solar, and then the other flexible resources are being replaced with batteries. And it works. It is important to, as I mentioned, all fuel sources are subject to the weather. This is during Winter Storm Yuris. This is from the FERC-NERC report on those outages. Obviously, a terrible event for Texas in particular. When you look at the numbers, 75% of the capacity that was on outage was fossil. 55% of the total was gas alone. And most of what happened is you just saw a drop off in gas production in the gas fields. The pipelines that deliver it to generators were constrained. And then as the power went off, that further hurt the gas system because many of the compressors were electric. And when they were offline, then the pipelines further lost pressure. And it just caused a cascading outage with very severe and over multiple days, very severe outages in Texas. So again, all resources were affected. That's what extreme cold does. And so having a diversity of resources is key, but also having geographic diversity is key. And this is where transmission comes in. So these are power prices. This is the snapshot I took off the MISO website on the morning of February 15th, 2021, which is basically right as the power went off in ERCOT and MISO was really starting to hurt from the extreme cold. And you can see, the very high power prices, particularly in the southern part of MISO. What's notable is over in PJM, which is the eastern part here, the power prices were very low, 45, $50. because it wasn't that cold on the East Coast. The Southeast, it was normal temperature. Canada was normal for Canada, and it was really just this in the center of the country. There was this extreme incursion of cold air that came down through MISO, the Southwest Power Pool, and into Texas. And so MISO was able to import 13,000 megawatts of power from PJM, from Canada, from the Southeast, and then was able to send another 8,000 megawatts of that onto the Southwest Power Pool to its west. So you had 13,000 megawatts coming into MISO. ERCOT, because its own interconnection is not synchronously tied to the rest of the US grid, was only able to import 800 megawatts. So MISO was bringing in 15 times more power than Texas could. And that's really the tale of two cities there, that ERCOT just could not import enough power to keep the lights on. MISO could. But you can see from this chart that there was a lot more cheap power over on the East Coast that MISO could not access. You can see the transmission congestion there really hitting hard, kind of at that MISO PJM seam in northern Illinois, Indiana. And so we do need more transmission to better protect and protect consumers against these high prices during events like this. And this is the way it worked this time. In other events, the power price map has been reversed. PJM was really expensive if it was super cold on the East Coast, and MISO had cheap power and was sending it eastward. So everybody benefits from building transmission. The power is going to flow both ways. And you can actually see that this is exactly what happened in 2019. You may remember there was a polar vortex event in MISO, extreme cold, negative 30 type temperatures you've never seen really in recent history. And you can see these are power prices in MISO and PJM. And you can see that basically 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 in the morning, that first day, the cold weather moves into MISO, takes off a lot of generation, causes demand to spike. Power prices go super high in MISO, as you'd expect. PJM prices stay low, and the power flows kind of follow that. There was a lot of power. PJM went up, it was still very good, particularly in Illinois, that was flowing into MISO and keeping the lights on there. Over the course of that day and into the next day, the cold weather moved eastward. And you can see then PJM, the power prices spike higher by that evening in PJM because the cold weather moved into that footprint and the power is flowing the other way. And so you see that this beneficial relationship, that power moves both ways. And transmission expansion is really going to be essential for making the grid bigger than the weather, which helps with wind and solar, but also helps during events where it takes off 40% of the gas fleet or causes demand to spike. So it solves pretty much anything that can happen. So that kind of covers how we should think about planning for a reliable grid and capturing diversity. Diversity also plays a big part in how we operate the grid day to day. As I was talking about, weather systems don't affect if your wind plants are spread out, the weather is going to move over many hours or days across the wind fleet. Same thing with solar fleet. If there's clouds in a local area, somewhere else it's not going to be cloudy, and the grid kind of deals with that. And so most of the fluctuations in wind and solar output at the plant level get canceled out by another wind or solar plant somewhere. Same thing happens with electricity demand. If you turn on your air conditioner or your dryer, odds are most other people aren't at that time, and that's how the grid works. It captures that kind of diversity in supply and demand, and that's a much cheaper way of operating things than everybody having to meet their own demand. If anybody's looked at the economics of trying to go off grid, it's extremely challenging because you don't have any diversity. It's just you and the solar panels and maybe the battery you're putting in. It's extremely challenging to make that work. Capturing the diversity of the grid is extremely cost effective and really keeps the the numbers here on the right side and in the text here show that even at very high penetrations of wind and solar, it's very cheap. The increase in the flexibility you need is very manageable because of that diversity in the wind and solar. We also, the grid has to be operated to deal with the loss of large fossil and nuclear plants, and that's far more costly, even at very high wind and solar penetrations, because a large, fossil or nuclear plant trips instantaneously, and you need to replace that extremely quickly to keep the grid stable. And so as a result, you have to have those reserves ready 24/7. You don't know when you're going to need them. With wind and solar, you do forecasting, when the weather is about to change and the wind might drop off, and you can plan around that, and therefore you can use cheaper resources. You can have offline resources that can start up quickly if you need them, and that keeps the cost a lot lower. was talking about the geographic diversity, this really shows it. So the left chart here that basically shows that, over the course, if you go even, 50, 100 miles out from between two wind plants over 5-minute and 30-minute time periods, there's essentially no correlation in their output, which makes sense that, if there's a weather event hitting this one, a cold front's moving through and hitting this one wind project 100 miles away is not affecting that one yet. And you can see that this is extremely powerful for reducing kind of the variability in wind and solar output. It also helps you deal with forecast error. If the weather forecast was off in this area, it's likely because weather system moved more quickly or more slowly, and it's increasing output at other plants that are making up for the ones that were lower than you expected. And so you also reduce the forecast error by having geographic diversity. This is, I mentioned, a lot of this is done by MISO. They do have an extremely efficient market that runs every 5 minutes and optimizes around these changes. And that greatly reduces the cost relative to if we're trying to operate things hourly and then using reserves to fill in for gaps within the hour. And so you can see that, and MISO also does wind forecasting. So basically this chart's showing kind of two of the things that MISO does that really reduce the cost of wind variability. So this is basically showing the forecast error going out into the future. So, 5 minutes, 10 minutes ahead, the wind, what the wind is doing now is likely what's going to be doing 10 minutes from now. 6 hours out, that's a little more challenging, and you can see going out farther to the right, the forecast error goes up. And so you do forecasting to reduce that error, get a better sense of what the wind is going to do. But more importantly, you move decisions as far to the left as you can. You use your fast 5-minute market to respond to the changes in the wind and solar output. And so you're not having to carry a lot of reserves to deal with that forecast error. You're just dispatching the power plants you have. You have this, 100 plus gigawatts of supply that can respond to market signals and will go up and down in response to whatever you need. We're also, I mentioned earlier, wind and solar are increasingly providing a lot of the services, the flexibility to keep the lights on. The utility Excel in Minnesota and Colorado regularly now uses wind output to follow changes in electricity demand. So overnight, when they've got a lot of wind on their system, they'll turn off their thermal generation and use wind to balance the system. So they'll dispatch the wind plants up and down to follow fluctuations in electricity demand overnight, and basically are using wind as a fully dispatchable resource. It's extremely fast and accurate, much more than any type of thermal plant. Solar is even faster than that. A wind plant can do 0 to 100 in 10 seconds. Solar plants, batteries, it's basically as fast as you want to build the controls. Sub-second type thing response is possible with those resources. It's all digitally controlled. There's no real moving parts. And so these are incredibly flexible resources to give you can provide a lot of reliability services. And as wind and solar get cheaper and we have more of them, and they're being curtailed because we have so much of them, I think they're going to increasingly provide this flexibility, which you can see basically that's what's happening here. The left is kind of what we do today. There's a lot of curtailment. They're moving to where this is a theoretical model for Tampa. With a lot of solar, they could turn off their thermal generation, which you see as the blue lines that kind of goes down. Like this is what Excel is doing now. They turn off their thermal generation and use solar to balance the system, which is really, saves fuel, saves solar that would have been curtailed. So it's good for everybody. So there's a lot of sources of flexibility on the grid. This is a chart from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory going through different types of flexibility and basically showing their cost, is a supply curve. So as you go up and to the right, the cost goes up. But you can see, there's a lot of, with efficient markets and transmission and things like that, there's a lot of ability to access low cost flexibility. So finally, I'm going to talk about some of those very fast reserves, and I've only got a couple minutes. I want to leave time for some Q&A. So if you haven't, just a reminder, if you were going to do a question, it's a good time to submit in the chat, please. Okay, so last couple slides. There's a lot of these other reliability services that are really essential for keeping the grid stable. And this is things like when you lose a large fossil or nuclear plant and you need 2 gigawatts of power very quickly, some of that has to happen in seconds and less, and that's all automatic control. Basically, power plants increase their output automatically, this is something it's needed so quickly, you can't rely on a human operator to do it. It's programmed in and they automatically increase their output. Batteries are obviously extremely fast, can do that, and in many regions are now providing that service. They're ramping up if you lose a large fossil or nuclear plant or something like that. There's a lot of other types of flexibility going down there. Frequency regulation is the kind of the second to second dispatch. And as I was showing, wind, solar storage can do that. So really, reactive power voltage, I won't go into too much into that, but it kind of makes the power flow efficiently on the grid. It's like pressure in a water system, and you need it to kind of make the grid stay reliable. Wind, solar storage are great at that. They can provide whatever voltage, they have extreme flexibility to respond to voltage fluctuations and provide and hold up the system voltage. Basically, what it comes down to is wind, solar storage are digitally controlled devices. We used to use rotating synchronous generators, in our thermal or nuclear power plants, and those were kind of like using a cassette tape or a record player or a CD, where kind of the rotating energy was what allowed you to control the speed and things like that. With MP3 players and digital music, it's much more flexible. You can start and stop and jump around wherever you want. With the spinning device, there's a lot less flexibility and a lot less speed in which you can kind of make the resource respond. And so that's kind of the analogy I use, is that wind, solar, and storage are like MP3 players, and what we used to use was cassettes and record players, and they worked, but there's a lot of new capabilities that come out from these digitally controlled devices that are extremely fast and can do almost anything you tell them to do. And you can see here is the chart at the bottom there. There's wind plants are regulating the voltage. You can see the areas where their WTG is wind turbine generators. When they're online, the voltage is very tightly held around what where it's supposed to be, which is what you want to see. And then kind of they were testing this, and so they took them offline, and you can see the voltage starts going up and down, which is not what you want to see. And so real world example of the turbines regulating voltage. And there's just a couple quotes I threw in there from NERC showing this is real. FERC has made orders that basically now fully require wind, solar storage to do what conventional resources do for voltage, for frequency. So the big story is technology has done amazing things, and we're still figuring out new things that these digitally controlled devices can do. So there's a lot of reason for optimism, I think, is a good way to sum it up. So that's all I had. Happy to take questions. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Michael. And thanks for reminding folks about the Q&A. We did have a bunch of questions roll in. So I'll just start with a policy question. Where do you envision policymaking on reliability transmission issues to occur? Is it a state level or federal level? Is it legislatures, regulatory agencies? What are the key policy venues here?
You want to go first, John?
Sure. All levels. It's Congress has been really reluctant to get in this space. They passed some backstop authority for years ago, but then really didn't back that up when the courts gave a negative opinion of it. So it really is state regulators are very involved in MISO and need to be a part of the planning process, be a part of the cost allocation formula process. That's a lot. FERC will give a lot of deference to the state commissions on those issues. The stakeholders in MISO, of which state regulators and the consumer advocates are a part of, that's a very pivotal place where decisions are made. FERC will continue to prod, that they're doing with their NOPR right now on transmission, to get RTOs and better transmission planning across the grid. But it's more of a cajole rather than a requirement. So I think your highest levels of influence right now are state regulators, probably governors, and their ability to influence MISO and our footprint, and FERC continuing to try and do as much as they can, but lack a little bit of teeth.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, the success story I always use is the MISO MVPs, which I think were heavily driven by governors and state commissioners. There was some cajoling from FERC, but it was mostly a bottom-up thing. And so I think you need both things. You need the bottom-up, political support in the states, and you need the top-down, the FERC willingness to kind of push a little bit to make it happen. And that's the recipe for success that we've seen in, the MISO VPs and other in other areas. That's what works.
Great. We had a good question about who bears the cost of building the generation and transmission that is shared across, when benefits are shared across a region or across the grid. So how do you balance those things? What are the critical ways to do that?
John,
Go first.
Yeah.
Go first, and I'll jump in.
Okay, yeah. So I'll talk, generation and transmission are done differently. So, and it depends on what state you're in. In MISO states, they're mostly vertically integrated utilities. And so the Iowa Utility Board would review any utility procurement and, generation plans to make sure that they're cost effective and prudent and in the consumer's interest. In other regions, PJM, New York, New England, that's done through a wholesale market. There's a lot less role of the utilities and the state regulators. There's kind of, these are just merchant generators that buy and sell into the market. There's bilateral contracts, but there's a lot less regulatory role. The market does a lot of that. But in Iowa, generation is heavily regulated. But then, that output and the capacity is then sold into the MISO markets. On transmission, the cost allocation is the huge problem. As we've shown, transmission provides benefits over large areas during extreme weather, just during normal operations. The bigger the transmission, the bigger the geographic spread of the benefits. And we haven't figured out great ways to spread those costs to reflect that those benefits are spread so broadly. There are a few exceptions. The MISO MVPs were very successful. The recent MISO Tranche 1, we were able to develop a cost allocation methodology to spread those costs over a large region. But we still, there's still, within MISO, there are still obstacles. There's a very strong need for transmission in MISO South and between MISO South and North, but there's no agreement on who should pay for that. Similarly, transmission between MISO and PJM is extremely tricky. There's no real functional way to pay for that, even though it provide large benefits to both regions. FERC is looking at this. I think what we've seen is that there just needs to be a broad cost allocation across everybody that benefits, but politically, it's hard to get there.
It is politically hard to get there. It's such a balkanized system, and that historical stuff I talked about. I mean, it was radical when FERC in '96 said, let's start planning and sharing transmission assets to create a more reliable system, more competition. You would think there would have been this total buy-in. Yeah, that makes sense. But there are a lot of people with vested interests in not having this advance, and cost allocation becomes a huge issue to stall over, because you're looking 25, 30 years out and trying to establish benefit metrics. In any industry or any sector, that's never going to be exact. But it basically empowers the folks who don't want to move the system forward and expand transmission because of the threat it is to competition to them. They will exploit the estimating process of that analysis.
Yeah, and just to put a little finer point on it, transmission is a public good. It's like roads or police or fire department. Everybody needs it at some point. And it's just a question of, how, we use taxes to pay for, roads and police and fire. We don't use taxes to pay for transmissions. We need to figure out some other way to kind of make sure everybody pays for it, because there's a huge free rider problem. If I can, get away with not paying for it and benefiting from it, I would. And so we need some way to kind of make the people that benefit from the transmission pay for it.
And the political resistance to Congress doing this, I know is great, but we should have, just like Amarillo has done a study, we should have a national transmission plan, deploy a national transmission grid, and have a national systems benefits charge where we all fund that. And we would accelerate this transition in a much more economical and reliable way. But unfortunately, I think I'm a pipe dream.
We have so many additional really, really good questions that I wish we could get to, and lots of really good, especially questions about how, as we move to more regional and national constructs, how, state regulators can ensure, that lights stay on for their residents and meet their obligations as well. And it's been a, kind of a constant tension of how those two things work together. And I think will continue to be even more so as this transition continues. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for all your great questions. Thank you so much for John and Michael for presenting today. We will be sending out the webinar as a recording to everyone who registered. And so there should be opportunity to share this information. We'll also be publishing a handy reliability sort of cheat sheet from Michael after this as well, that will go out to folks that you can reference with a lot of the information that he shared today for the future. And please feel free to follow up with IEC with any questions. And yeah, thank you so much for your participation today.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's great being here. And I'm just reading through the questions now. You guys should die to answer some of those, but maybe you can get my contact information if you carry it at Iowa Environmental Council and drop me a note. Happy to help with anybody going forward.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. Take care.